It is April 1945. Nazi Germany is on its knees, and the Soviets are poised to deliver the killing blow in Berlin. All that stands in their way is a seemingly modest line of hills west of the river Oder. Marshal Georgy Zhukov stands impatiently at his command post, aware that the end of the war is mere days away. Meanwhile, the soldiers of Army Group Vistula, assembled months earlier from battered remnants and new recruits, brace themselves, fearfully awaiting the imminent flood from the east. Since the beginning of the year, the Soviet Red Army had reversed all of Germany's gains on the Eastern Front and began a relentless push westward, reclaiming all of its former Soviet territories along with occupying new ones in Eastern Europe. By April, they stood poised along the Oder and Neisse rivers, just 37 miles or 59 kilometers east of Berlin. Still, a final push on the Nazi capital was off the table, as the Germans threw every resource they had into curbing the Soviet advance. One of the primary obstacles for the Soviets was the Seelow Heights, a series of elevated ridges overlooking the Oder's floodplain. It was a natural defensive barrier that provided the entrenched Germans with a formidable position to repel the Soviet advance. Both the floodplain and the natural elevation would be sorely needed by the defenders, given the dire wartime situation. Facing the Germans was Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front, a force numbering over 1 million soldiers spread across 10 armies, which included battle-hardened groups like the 8th Guards Army, 1st Polish Army, 5th Shock Army, and the 1st Guards Tank Army. Zhukov's forces included thousands of artillery pieces specifically organized into 200 regiments and 30 brigades, alongside having numerous mortar and guards mortar units. Armored strength was equally impressive, with more than 3,000 tanks and self-propelled guns assembled for the assault. Supporting the front's efforts were the 16th and 18th Air Armies, capable of deploying nearly 4,000 aircraft all across the front's offensive zone. With such overwhelming concentrations of both manpower and firepower, Zhukov's forces were all but assured of victory. In an effort to delay the inevitable, the German 9th Army, under General Theodor Busse, was given the grave responsibility of holding off the advancing Red Army. Busse's forces were diverse, consisting of infantry, panzer, and panzer grenadier divisions. But in terms of composition, the 9th Army was a shadow of its former strength. Constant defeats on multiple fronts, severe shortages in fuel and munitions due to relentless Allied bombing campaigns, and the catastrophic loss of Romania's oil fields the previous year had drastically weakened German combat capabilities. Many units were critically under strength, and replacements were few and inexperienced. Soldiers faced not only dwindling supplies and ammunition, but a crushing decline in morale. Moreover, desperate attempts to mobilize more troops led to the impressment of poorly trained Volkssturm militia. It was clear to many senior officers within Army Group Vistula that Germany's military power was collapsing rapidly. Busse's own men stood on the precipice, burdened by fatigue, anxiety, and the grim recognition that the battle awaiting them might be their last. General Busse himself remained optimistic, knowing that in front of the advancing Soviet armies lay the Oder River's broad floodplain, a once fertile valley that was left completely flooded by nature, along with a little help from the 9th Army. Spring thaws had already saturated the low-lying Oderbrush Valley, and German engineers deliberately opened upstream reservoirs to flood the land, turning the fields into a swampy quagmire. Combined with the extensive minefields already laid prior to the Soviet advance, the Germans had effectively created a treacherous no-man's land meant to slow the enemy. Tanks and foot soldiers would become bogged down in mud and canal ditches, leaving them exposed targets for German anti-tank batteries and machine guns firing from the heights above. Beyond the floodplain, the ground rose abruptly into the Seelow Heights, a series of ridges that rose roughly 40 to 60 meters over the horizon. Any Soviet troops struggling forward in the open expanse would have to climb this slope under relentless fire from well-positioned German batteries, a scenario that greatly favored the defenders on the high ground. The Germans had also fortified this natural stronghold extensively. At the foot of the heights and along its slopes, they dug deep anti-tank ditches and erected an intricate network of trenches and bunkers. Concrete gun emplacements and machine gun nests were embedded into the terrain, covering the few viable paths up the hill. In fact, the Seelow heights were only the first defensive line. Behind them, the Germans had constructed 3 successive belts of defenses stretching west toward Berlin. The final belt, ominously nicknamed the Wotan Line, lay about 10 to 15 miles or 16 to 24 kilometers behind the front and served as a last fallback position. These layered fortifications ensured that the Soviet attackers would face multiple obstacles and kill zones even after breaching the initial line. All told, the combination of the flooded ground, commanding high ground, and prepared defenses made the Seelow Heights a formidable barrier for the Red Army's advance. As Bosa himself later stated, despite the difficulties arising from the lack of cover and the limitations in the construction of positions, there was an advantage with this terrain in which ditches and swamps precluded the use of armor. Attacks here could only succeed using great masses of infantry, strong artillery with plentiful ammunition, and strong air forces. Little did he know at the time, that was exactly the Soviet strength. One of the biggest headaches we deal with in our daily routines is the non-stop flood of junk mail, spam emails, and telemarketing calls. And a big reason for that? Data brokers. These companies collect your personal info and sell it to marketers or make it available online without you even realizing it. People search sites expose your address, phone number, and other personal details to pretty much anyone. And it's not just marketers buying this info. Potential employers, landlords, random strangers, or worse yet, people with bad intentions like scammers or identity thieves can all easily access this data online. That's why I want to thank today's sponsor, Incogni. They help protect your personal data and keep it out of the hands of those who shouldn't have it. Incogni protects your privacy by reaching out to data brokers on your behalf and asking them to remove your info. I've used Incogni and it's incredibly easy to get started. You just make an account, give Incogni permission to act for you, and they handle everything else. They deal with pushback from data brokers and keep you updated on their progress, making the whole thing a hands-off experience. They also have a money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free for 30 days. If you want to support the channel and take back a little control over your privacy, check out Incogni with our link in the description and use code ArmchairHistorian for 60% off an annual plan. At 3 a.m. on April 16th, the Soviet offensive opened with a thunderous artillery barrage. The magnitude of the Soviet bombardment was almost incomprehensible for the defending Germans. Over 9,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers unleashed onto their positions. The ground itself trembled as artillery shells slammed into the earth, while the skies were filled with the roars of Katyusha rockets streaking overhead in blinding arcs of fire. For many of the Folkstorm recruits huddled in their trenches, the barrage would have felt like hell itself was raining down on them. The next hour saw the night sky flashing with artillery fire, turning pitch-black fields into a strobe-lit battleground as shells and rockets battered the German defensive line. Marshal Zhukov had hoped this colossal bombardment would shatter the German defenses in one swift blow. But unbeknownst to him, the deep dugouts and concrete bunkers constructed by the defenders meant that many Germans lived to man their weapons when the barrages finally ceased. Inside these bunkers and trenches, soldiers gripped their rifles and peered through firing slits, waiting for the Soviet tide to appear. As the bombardment subsided, Soviet positions flooded the hills with searchlights, hoping to blind the enemy while revealing their positions. As Bosa pointed out, the lack of natural cover left the hills opened and exposed. However, these lights did little to help, as dust and smoke kicked up by their own artillery, blanketed the area and left waves of soldiers piling up as they struggled to push through the backlit smog. Slogging forward through the flooded lowlands of the Oder, entire Soviet units found themselves bogged down in thick mud. Tanks and self-propelled guns struggled to gain traction, occasionally sinking down into half-submerged ditches churned up by their own shelling. Infantrymen stumbled through waist-deep water, burdened by soaked uniforms and the weight of their gear. Artillery support also proved difficult to coordinate. Any misstep in the sodden ground risked immobilizing their precious guns. These delays robbed the Soviet attack of some of its momentum, allowing the German defenders perched on the heights above to reorganize. When Soviet forces finally crested the lower slopes, they met a wall of resistance from German machine guns and artillery hidden among the trenches and bunkers. German troops emerged to direct accurate fire on the approaching Soviets. The tight, elevated defenses channeled Red Army battalions into corridors of crossfire, inflicting heavy losses. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe scraped what little resources it had left into continuous sorties aimed at blunting the Soviet river crossings. Everything from fighters, heavy bombers, flying bombs, and even German kamikaze pilots were thrown at the Soviet bridgeheads. Yet, despite these setbacks, the Red Army pressed on, buoyed by their sheer numbers and desperate to secure a breakthrough. Over the day of April 16th, German commanders on the Seelow Heights quickly realized that meeting the Red Army head-on would lead to unnecessary losses. Instead, they adopted a careful rhythm of tactical withdrawals and sudden counterattacks. Their defenders made full use of the ridge's natural contours. As soon as Soviet formations threatened to overrun a forward trench, German troops would pull back to higher, more defensible positions, forcing the Soviets to attack uphill once again. These orderly withdrawals kept the Red Army advancing at a crawl, all while inflicting steady attrition on its ranks. Meanwhile, the Germans launched sporadic but focused counterattacks, often at moments when Soviet battalions became disorganized. Whenever a breakthrough in the Soviet line appeared, be it a bogged-down infantry section or an exposed flank, German Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units would strike. Their tanks, though limited in number, found opportunities to fire from concealed positions along the slopes. These sharp thrusts further slowed the Soviet advance, creating unexpected pockets of fierce combat throughout the day. Even with these tactical victories, the sheer weight of the Soviet onslaught took a devastating toll on both sides. Thanks to their ever-flowing reinforcements, the Red Army could press forward relentlessly, deploying wave after wave of infantry and armor under withering German fire. Soviet T-34s and assault guns rolled forward, sometimes dragging trapped vehicles out of the mud so the column behind could continue the assault. The cost in lives was staggering. Every new push left the fields and waterlogged ditches scattered with Soviet casualties. Still, the Red Army showed little sign of weakening. Spurred on by Zhukov's unyielding orders, fresh reserves were funneled straight to the front lines to replace units that had been decimated. It was a grinding, relentless battle of attrition. For every German gun that poured fire onto Soviet ranks, another Soviet platoon or tank regiment stood ready to push forward. On the morning of April 17th, Zhukov ordered renewed attacks, desperate to regain lost momentum. Mixed elements from the 248th and 301st Rifle Divisions, along with the 9th Rifle Corps, successfully pushed through the village of Guso to the north of Seelow. German resistance remained stubborn, but began showing clear signs of deterioration as more sectors fell. Each successive defense line, once breached, forced the Germans into increasingly hasty retreats, tightening the Red Army's noose around the beleaguered defenders. By the early afternoon, elements of the 57th Guards Rifle Division and 11th Tank Corps entered the town of Seelow itself. The next day, Buse's 9th Army had reached its limit, with German resistance petering out as each sector across the Seelow Heights was overwhelmed by Soviet envelopments. After days of relentless combat, the 8th Guards Army finally broke through the Wotan line, and with it, The First Belarusian Front had finally achieved their decisive breakthrough over the course of April 19th. The German forces, now fragmented and disoriented, faced envelopment from multiple directions. Attempts to regroup or retreat were futile, leading to the collapse of organized resistance in the area as the gates to Berlin were left wide open. Overall, the battle exacted a devastating toll on both sides. Soviet casualties were horrific, with self-reported estimates claiming 33,000 soldiers killed, though other estimates almost double that total. German losses were also severe, with nearly 12,000 soldiers killed and tens of thousands captured during the battle. The once strategic high ground was transformed into a landscape of devastation, marked by destroyed fortifications, abandoned equipment, and the scars of intense artillery bombardments. The shattered remnants of the German Ninth Army fell back in disarray, many heading toward Berlin to make a final stand in the ruined capital. The Red Army was poised to crush Hitler's war machine once and for all.